As ugly and painful as this place was, I chose to be grateful to be here versus gone. And with that choice, another shift occurred. I made a decision to get over it, to get up and get on with it.
I don't know if that's something he should be doing. I mean, if he is, I hope to God he learned something from this past experience, because it was criminal.
He has no understanding of real trauma, and yet he's kind of purporting to be sort of an expert on that.
This is True Crime Arizona, the podcast.
Hey, this is James.
And Bear.
Today,
by now, you're used to James Ray's style and the things he talks about. It's all about self-growth.
2020, 2021 is the greatest opportunity that God and life have ever gifted you. And if you're not finding the gift, it's because you have bought into the lie that the challenges are here to make your life miserable. They're not. They're here to help you to grow.
This next audio clip is how he defines a warrior. But the thing is, this isn't audio from when he used to be on stage speaking before the Sedona tragedy. James Arthur Ray is back. This is present day.
Today, let's talk about what it means to be a warrior. You know, there's a lot of people doing warrior workshops, and I'm going to suggest to you that there's a real misnomer and misunderstanding about the term warrior. As far as the ancients are concerned, you know, it's not about too much testosterone. It's not about climbing mountains with logs on your back. It's not about running around in the snow with your shirt off. That's all well and good. But, you know, when I worked with the Toltec shaman in the Andes, and we went to the burial grounds, over 60% of the shaman that were buried there, called warriors, were women. Imagine that.
What'd you say?
Yeah. So what does it mean to be a warrior to you, Bear?
To understand how and what James Ray is doing now, let's go back a bit. July 12th, 2013.
A white van pulls up, and out comes a long-haired, few pounds heavier James Arthur Ray walking out of the Lewis State Prison this morning. Swarms of media waited outside as the once self-help guru left a prison he called home for nearly a year and a half.
As cameras rolled on James Ray leaving his life in prison behind, nobody knew what would be next for the self-help guru. He had lost so much money and a lot of his following, yet he didn't stay under the radar for long.
I've decided to put together a video series about turning crisis and challenge into opportunity, because I truly believe that potential is there, but it's up to you.
That next year, he took his teachings and talents to YouTube, often talking about how the tragedy experience and prison time gave him a renewed sense of purpose and of self-reflection to be better. It was clear he was trying to build his brand back up, and in 2020 came the most candid look into his thoughts. He wrote and released a book called The Business of Redemption.
Well, it really upsets me that he's profiting off the story of my daughter's death and twisting it into he is the victim of this event.
The Brown family was already frustrated by the phone call from James days after Kirby died. They felt he was sorrier for himself than he was for the loss of others. But this book was a deep dive into exactly how he felt about everything in his own words: prison, the deaths, his life. I read the entire book for research for this podcast, and it was definitely an interesting read. After everything I've learned about James and what happened through my investigation, this was the first time I was getting a look into what he thinks. I've mentioned it before, but I've reached out to James Ray and his team multiple times asking to interview him about all of this, but continue to get no response. So, we're going to take you into the pages of his book as he describes what happened, and we have a voice actor reading for us. The first chapter is called Introduction, "I am responsible." These quotes stuck out to me.
I am responsible for the deaths of 3 people. At my urging, 3 people, James Shore, Liz Newman, and Kirby Brown, pushed themselves too far, ending their lives and forever changing mine. I had never in all my years of holding sweat lodge events seen anyone foam at the mouth. This is crazy. What's going on? Authentic leadership will cost you something.
I think for many, this was the first time they had seen James take ownership for the deaths. But of the people I've interviewed, some feel this was just too little too late. The damage was already done by his demeanor and actions. James also writes about his time in prison and being incarcerated.
The officer put me in the back of a police cruiser. I would later learn this was Detective Diskin, the man in charge of my investigation. I wouldn't learn until much later how little investigation was actually conducted. From the moment I was informed they were investigating it as a homicide on October 8th, their sights were set and their minds made up.
He remembers when he got to the jail and they took him through the front door.
The press had packed the parking lot and cameras were rolling. By now it was dark and everything was lit with massive press floodlights. A sea of people pushed against the barricades they had constructed to get their best shot. Not only people from the press, but townspeople as well. I felt like a gladiator being led to the slaughter. I never made any comment to the press during the whole process. I certainly wasn't going to start now.
What he wrote next about the press is interesting. I mean, this was the guy who lived for press and attention and was going on to news shows and talk shows all the time before. The Sedona tragedy was extensively covered, as it should be. But this is what James writes about the media.
It's not the press's fault that there are few true journalists anymore, mostly just sensationalists. It's our fault. If we didn't listen to it and buy it, they'd sell us something else. If we did our own research and called them out, maybe they'd be forced to do theirs. Maybe, if we cared more, they would as well. They're just giving us exactly what we want.
I was really interested to read about what James had to say about prison. He had been used to living the millionaire life. Beautiful homes, luxury resorts, the finest amenities wherever he went. Prison was obviously the exact opposite of any of that. Other inmates didn't care who he was.
Most of these guys couldn't care less that people once paid me 10 grand a pop to hear what they would potentially hear for free. They didn't give 2 shakes about what I had to say. They were so drunk on their own wine, they didn't care that I could potentially offer them finer wine. None but a very, very few, that is. Of course, the big reveal was that I was drunk on my own wine as well. Sloppy drunk. In state prison, where I spent my sentence, you're an animal at worst and a number at best. Property of the state is what you're labeled, and exactly how you're treated. Not a human being, property. As ugly and painful as this place was, I chose to be grateful to be here versus gone. And with that choice, another shift occurred. I made a decision to get over it, to get up and get on with it.
He writes about eventually helping coach and guide some of the inmates who did look to him for life advice. That gave him purpose while he was living in his cell. He talks about his life before the fame and fortune. He worked in construction and then AT&T. He went to school for business management, but went back and studied behavioral sciences. And he lived in a bunch of cities around the US. He found he was good at engaging with people and left AT&T to create his own business. There's obviously been a lot said about James over the course of this season on the podcast, that he's just all about money, that he didn't ever have proper training, that he up and left Angel Valley when the tragedy happened and didn't stay with the participants. that he manipulated vulnerable people and that's why they couldn't get out of the sweat lodge, that he knew people were hurt and did nothing about it until it was too late. I didn't know how much of this, if any of this, James would address in the book. I wanted to get his side of the story. Turns out, he would address all of it. Let's start with the money part and the fortune he amassed by charging people a lot of money to attend his events and retreats.
For me, it was never about money. It was about the work. It was about the sense of accomplishment. It was about contributing and doing something that felt meaningful. Even later, when I was making millions of dollars per year, the money is never what drove me. It was more about the craft and the product and service. After the trial in prison, I was literally left with nothing. Everything I had worked for decades to build, my entire empire, was gone in the blink of an eye. Except I wasn't just left with zero, I was left with less than zero. I had lost my home, my business, my car, every worldly possession, and every penny I worked so hard to earn. Not only that, I was $20 million in debt. When you're $20 million in the red, zero starts to look pretty damn good. From where I stood broke was a long climb up.
Since James didn't take the stand himself at the trial, we hadn't really heard his own raw account of what happened at Spiritual Warrior. A whole chapter of this book is dedicated to his account of what happened that night during the sweat lodge, what he claims he did or didn't do, and what he saw and heard.
Each attendee signed a comprehensive release form when they registered for the event, acknowledging that the exercises were physically challenging and completely voluntary, and also that they were completely responsible for themselves. The release also stated that there were potential health risks, up to and including death. Furthermore, it informed them that advice from a physician should be obtained prior to the event, and that neither I nor my company would be held liable for any pre-existing medical condition or any unforeseen but pre-advised potential outcome. I hired one of the best law firms in California, Greenberg and Glusker, to draw up these rock-solid releases of liability and full personal responsible forms. I really thought they meant something. Little did I know.
It's things said like that really bother the Brown family.
He came out and spun this whole thing into, I'm the only person in history that has suffered because of other people's decisions. They decided to stay in the tent, and because of that, they died.
If he really had taken the time to understand what happened, I would be less concerned, but I don't see that. You know, what I see is him using what happened as like a marketing tool. He'll talk about how he went through the worst experience of his life, and as a result, now he's stronger. He's even said things like, this had to happen for me to grow so that I can share this experience and my knowledge with you. And that's just crazy.
A lot of people claimed he was never properly trained on how to conduct a sweat lodge, and that it was abominating something sacred in the Native American culture that he was not a part of. He wrote about how he learned about it all.
Sweat lodge is a big part of the shamanic traditions and is found in many cultures, going all the way back to Greco-Roman era, if not even earlier. I studied with a shaman in the Andes for a couple of years. I also attended Native American events and studied different shamanic modalities from other cultures. Hence, I knew the power of experimental learning and had long utilized various modalities and means.
He knew the Native American community was in an uproar after the tragedy. He says he was not impersonating a Native American, as some thought he was.
Sweat lodge is a spiritual practice in many cultures, not just Native American. And in many cultures, it's just a purification, much like a sauna.
He goes on to make a point in the book again about how the Hamiltons built the sweat lodge before he got there, that he didn't build it or have any part in the structure of it. In the last episode, Amira Hamilton talked about that. It was built a year before the fatal spiritual warrior and had been used by several other leaders and retreat groups with no issues. Amira said if James had had a problem with the structure, he would have let her know. He didn't say anything to her. James writes that Liz Newman had been talking to him about wanting more of a leadership role. This is where he starts to describe being inside the sweat lodge.
During one of the later rounds, I heard someone say, "James, I'm concerned about Liz." I responded, "She's done this before. She knows what she's doing." I knew people were struggling, but struggle is part of the experience. Struggle is part of the experimental learning, and the metaphor for struggling is part of life.
James has said he did not know people were in that bad of shape until after the sweat lodge ceremony was over, when he noticed Kirby Brown and James Shore looked discolored, and said for the first time he saw people foaming at the mouth. He writes that it's a lot more people in distress than usual. Former Yavapai County Sheriff and investigator Scott Masher takes issue with James claiming he didn't know people were in that concerning of condition during the ceremony.
I don't agree with that. Just from what I read and hearing what people said there, he was told there are people in there unconscious, and these people told investigators, he said, good. You know, that's good. They're going into other levels of self-healing and stuff. So, you know, he knew what was going on. People were telling him.
James writes about the moments after everyone is out of the sweat lodge. This is also when people claim James just walked away from the scene and left the participants there. This is what he says from his perspective about that.
People were performing CPR on several individuals, including James and Kirby. I'm not trained in CPR, but I had team members who were. My team and I had made sure of that in advance. A great deal was made of the fact that I was in my room during the trial and in the media that reported the story. I understand that it looks bad out of context, but in context, the EMTs were there. They were trained and equipped to handle those in need of medical help. James and Kirby had already been flown out via helicopter. The rest of the clients had been sent back to their rooms to clean up and get themselves together physically and mentally. Some of the clients and participants not in need of medical help were in various degrees of shock or hysteria. I was better equipped to deal with them than anyone. I needed to get my head together so I could help them do the same.
James was told by detectives that this was being investigated as a homicide. He immediately called up a lawyer who he says told him to leave.
From a leadership perspective, I made the decision to leave Angel Valley. All I wanted to do at that point was to go to the hospital to be with Liz and my clients, the families, and others. Or, at the very least, just be there to make sure my greatest fears weren't going to be realized. I wanted to check on all my clients. I wanted to do whatever I could to ease their angst and pain. That was the entire thrust of the week. Yet I had to trust the advice of my lawyer as much as I wanted not to.
What infuriated people even more was that he went back on his speaking tour days later. James viewed this differently.
I didn't feel right canceling the event because people had purchased non-refundable airline tickets. My friend and colleagues had blocked off their schedules and planned their travel as well. We needed to honor our commitments.
Eventually, it didn't matter. Banks were dropping him, and he ended up having to shut down his company, which he says brought him to tears. James writes that after he got out of prison, nobody in California nor Arizona wanted to take him on as a renter for a condo because they either knew of the negative publicity and or because he had horrible credit. He ended up filing for bankruptcy. I don't know how well financially James Ray is doing now, but I do know he's still charging a lot for seminars and sessions, which, according to his website, are mostly over Zoom or virtual. His courses are still all about self-improvement, business, enriching your life, etc. These are the names of some of his upcoming Zoom events: Personal Purpose and Power, the Leadership for the Future Experience, the Redemptive Relationship Experience, the Way of the Warrior. Warrior. Sounds familiar. These are not cheap. The cheapest option within his events I could find was $400, but most of his cheapest options are $700. That's for the general experience. If you want the executive experience, those are $900. And if you want the platinum experience, it's $8,500, more than $8,000. That top experience gets you some coaching sessions online with James, monthly exercises and workbooks, and the ability to watch live Q&A sessions weekly with James and his wife, Bear. The reality here is James is still making money off self-help, but now incorporating the story of the Sweat Lodge experience into his teachings and knowledge. It unnerves Jenny and Jean Brown.
He has no understanding of the psychological dynamics of real trauma. And yet he's kind of purporting to be, sort of an expert on that. I can help you deal with these things in your life. I can help you with relationships. Well, he doesn't have any training in psychology. He has some good insight about people's vulnerabilities.
Just stop. Just do something else.
You can forgive someone but never trust them. He certainly is a talented person, and I'd like him to use his talents in another way. Go back to school, get a professional degree, and teach someplace, because you would be very good at that.
I asked everyone I interviewed for this investigation what they thought about James Ray being back out there practicing and profiting. Legally, he isn't doing anything wrong. He served his time, and he is now a free man. For some people, they view it more as an ethical concern. Here's what Amira Hamilton, the owner of Angel Valley, said.
If some people feel then that James Ray in 2022 has something to offer to them, well, who am I to say that they shouldn't do that? I mean, at this moment, it's not only James Ray's. There are so many things out there that you wonder, what's the truth? And people have to find their own way. And maybe at this moment, I don't know, I don't follow him. I do not know what his activities are, other than I hear that he is active. But he can only be active if people have an interest in what he's doing. Well, who am I to say that they are on the wrong path? I mean, they will find out or not. I mean, who am I to judge that?
Former Sheriff Scott Masher doesn't really know what to think.
I don't know what to think of it. I don't know if that's something he should be doing. I mean, if he is, I hope to God he learned something from this past experience, because it was criminal, and the jury came back with it being criminal.
Do you think something like this, some tragedy like this, is capable of happening again?
Well, yeah, I do. I do think that these kind of things can happen again. I would just hope that, people prepare a little better. If you're going to put people in risky situations, that you be prepared for the worst. To me, it's all about the victims. It's all about the family.
For Jared Dillingham, he's watched it all from the outside as he's reported on the case over the years and interviewed the families of the victims.
They will say that he's trying to use the deaths of their loved ones in this comeback, in this attempt at redemption. He has some sort of following these days, but I mean, it's nothing compared to what it was.
This happened in 2009. We're now in 2022. How does this story and the fallout and everything that's happened since compare to things you've covered in the last 13 years?
This, when you told me you were doing this, it piqued my interest because it was so sad, first of all. It was so bizarre. We haven't covered anything like this. We've covered a lot of criminal cases, court cases, tragedies, pandemics, but boy, this was just so strange because you would have these conversations with family members of the victims who were just left in disbelief. His fall from grace, I think that is what has really stuck with me as well. I mean, he was just a rising superstar at the time.
It all really bothers Connie Joy. She was so close to James for years, yet when she finally removed herself from his inner circle, she felt a lot of things were really concerning. She lost her friend, Liz Newman, in this tragedy. This is what she had to say about James Ray still selling his practices.
That's frightening to me because I never saw true remorse. If he hasn't learned, something's going to happen again if given the opportunity.
Connie added so much context to my investigation in many ways. How James Ray worked, what his relationship was like with his students or followers, and what happened at his events. I had some big questions for her after listening to it all.
How does everybody collectively let one man have this much power?
It starts little. First of all, the people who get sucked into this are people who want to help. Okay, so you want to help. I had over all the experiences of volunteering at these events, I was able to help a lot of people. I'm not trying to, it is just the way it is. People come to you, you sit with them one-on-one. For some people, this is the first time they ever had somebody that would listen to them about what's going on. So you got that, and it was something you wanted to do. He's very charismatic. He knows how to work you. An example being back to World Wealth Society. He knew what would catch Richard and I, what would hook us, would be working on a philanthropic project. He could turn into a chameleon to whatever it was that he knew you were looking for. Isn't that the trait of a con man? I mean, I got to see more of it behind the scenes when we volunteered, and that's kind of when the blinders came off.
What do you say to the people who look at these events and the followers over the years and say, these people seem like they were part of a cult?
The difference with a cult is, first of all, we're followers. Some people may feel they were followers because there's always groupies. We were students, and as long as he was giving us material we found useful, we would study on. Cults, here's the big difference. In James Ray's world, he controlled you with cult-like behaviors. He wouldn't let you, get together and talk about the events outside of the events. There's a lot of little things that went on that were cult-like behavior. But the big difference was, in a cult, you can't leave. In a James Ray world, the second you couldn't pay, you were out.
Jenny Brown felt the same way. She says her daughter Kirby was not part of a cult.
The people who were there were called cult members and freaks, and the fact of the matter is they were not cult members. They were not in a cult, but they were with a man who was using cult-like tactics to create the same kind of compliance that happens in a cult.
James Ray's last paragraph of the book is definitely intended to make you think, and he ends it with a question.
The path to redemption is endless. The path to redemption is challenging, dangerous, frustrating, and many times painful. But that's the price for the prize. That's the price you must pay for your purpose, and you alone can choose to do so. Can you make that choice fully and authentically? Will you?
What do you even do after you've been through an experience like what happened in Sedona? People lost sisters, daughters, friends, a husband, a dad. It was traumatic for so many, and after the dust settled, Connie Joy and Jenny and Jean Brown began writing books to put their reflective thoughts and feelings into writing. But Connie's book wasn't supposed to be about the tragedy, at least not at first.
So the book started positively?
Yes, I would say it was my journey. What it was, I was trying to deal with what we experienced together, what we learned.
She stopped writing it when everything happened. It was a friend who told her to keep going and to just change the trajectory of what it was about.
Who the hell wants to hear anything about this experience or me or anything? This is just, there's nothing I can dig out of this good. And she was the one who talked me out of it and said, no, it's important because people aren't going to understand why those people stayed in there. I also felt I had a responsibility. There's a bit of survivor's guilt in this because it could have been me. It could have been my daughter in there. It could have been my husband.
It's called Tragedy in Sedona. For Ginny and Jean Brown, their motivation was a little different. Ironically, Kirby had always told her mom she would be good at writing a book.
She kept telling me I needed to write a book. Little did I know the book I was going to write would be about her death.
She and Jean wrote about how Kirby's death affected them and how they got through it. It's called The Sweet Life: How We Lived After Kirby Died.
The whole section in the book that deals with grief is very important to me because I feel, again, when something like this happens in your life, you have some responsibility to learn and grow from it, and then to share that with others to hopefully help them in dealing with whatever tragedy or sadness they have to cope with in their life.
It didn't stop at a book for the Browns.
I asked myself, what do I need to do as a result of this? This never should have happened. It was wrong. How can we take this horrible event and have something positive come out of it?
They started an organization called Seek Safely.
We created the organization because we wanted people to understand that these kinds of things happen in the self-help world and pay attention. There are great teachers out there. There are great instructors and leaders, and many of them are professionals in their field. They know what they're talking about in terms of nutrition or psychology. And there are some people who don't have any professional training, and some of them can be very motivational or inspirational. But you can't have people without professional backgrounds talking like they do. The organization is to warn people, hopefully to give them a platform, maybe to tell their stories.
Ginny and Jean are very clear. They are not against people seeking self-help or looking for more purpose. In fact, they encourage it.
That's important, and it's a human thirst. But we need to go to people who are ethical and who are safe. So the organization was created because of what happened to our daughter that was wrong. What happened to James Shore and Liz Newman was wrong. But the mission is much bigger than our personal tragedy. I don't want to see this happen to someone else. And what we've learned about the self-help world is that people get hurt all the time, physically, definitely emotionally, very often financially, and people don't come forth with their stories. It's very similar to the Me Too movement. There's shame, there's embarrassment.
We respect people making this decision to try to be their best selves. So we don't want to discourage people from seeking, but we also we don't want people to get hurt. And again, like I said, this is the worst case scenario, but it's very common. People spend a lot of money on these things, or they incur, emotional or mental harm from these experiences with teachers who are really kind of operating out of their realm of expertise. We're also working on getting some legislation passed in New York State that's basically self-help consumer protection legislation.
This legislation is really important to the Browns. They are already creating so much awareness, but if they can actually change the law, that's an ultimate goal for them. First statewide, then nationwide.
We have some legislation pending in New York State right now to look at people who are working in this area of personal, professional development without professional certifications that are recognized by the state of New York and are getting paid to do that and are operating in an unsafe way. The legislation is asking them to have a risk management plan. He had no risk management plan. He had no medical professionals on site to take care of people if they got hurt.
It's been over 12 years since Kirby Brown, James Shore, and Liz Newman died. People will often tell you when they lose somebody close, especially so young, life does go on, but that emptiness never really does go away. You learn to live with it.
I think the last 12 years would have been very different. Kirby was a person of tremendous compassion and a problem solver. So she was always a very pivotal person in our family. She was the giver and the gatherer.
Jean had just gotten married months before Kirby died. Now, she's a mom of 2, and her kids are growing up so fast.
I've had this whole life since she died that she's not a part of. I have 2 kids now, so I think, when someone close to you dies, you miss a lot of the could have beens or the would have beens of, the things that they should have been there for in your life. I like to think that she's with us somehow, and I tell them stories about her and I show them photos of her, and we have actually a lot of things of hers around our house. So, I try to keep her sort of present in our lives. She would have been like the coolest aunt ever.
The Browns have chosen to find the beauty in death, though, too. They all had the best summer with Kirby before this happened and left nothing unsaid. It's a reminder to all of us to always say how you feel and express your emotions to the ones you love.
I have no regrets in my relationship with her. I felt like I said everything that I would want to say to her about how important she was to me and how much I loved her. It's a wonderful gift to not have regret when a relationship is ended because of death.
I think the thing that I want people to know about Kirby is that she lived her life to the fullest, and she did it by just finding joy in everything that she did.
To all of our listeners, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Sedona Sweat Lodge deaths investigation. If any of you have any connection or contact with James Ray, please reach out to me on social media. You can find me on any platform by just searching my name, Brianna Whitney. I would still like the opportunity to connect with him and interview him. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. This episode was edited by Hunter Norris and had voiceover work by Eric Zott. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.